The corridors of the Erebus were no longer the sterile, orderly halls Rainer had walked countless times. The infection had spread like wildfire, warping the ship into a grotesque blend of metal and organic matter. The walls pulsed faintly, their once smooth surfaces blistered with fleshy growths that oozed viscous black fluid. Overhead, lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the distorted architecture. The squad moved in a tight formation, weapons raised. The air was heavy, humid, and carried an acrid tang that clung to the back of Rainer's throat. Kendra was at the rear, her breathing shallow and uneven. Vega led the group, his stoic demeanor now a mask barely concealing the weight of their dwindling odds. "We're heading for the reactor core," Vega said, his voice clipped over the comms. "If we can overload it, we'll take the ship and the infection with us." Rainer glanced back at Kendra. Her face was pale, beads of sweat rolling down her temple. She hadn't said much since they'd armed themselves, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was terrified, just like the rest of them. They reached a junction, the path ahead splitting into two. Vega hesitated, consulting a flickering holographic map from his wrist-mounted display. "Rainer, you and Kendra take the left. I'll take the right. We'll rendezvous at the reactor." Rainer didn't like splitting up. "Sir, we should stick together." "There's no time for that," Vega snapped, his tone harsher than intended. He softened slightly, adding, "You've got this, Corporal." With a reluctant nod, Rainer motioned for Kendra to follow him. The two entered the left corridor, their boots squelching on the organic sludge coating the floor. The walls seemed to close in around them, their fleshy texture shifting under the dim light. Kendra broke the silence. This isn't just the ship being infected, it's evolving." Rainer didn't respond. He could see it too. The infection wasn't random. It was methodical, consuming and repurposing everything in its path. The once familiar corridors of the Erebus were becoming something alien, a living organism birthed from the ship's remains. Ahead, a faint noise broke the silence, a wet, slithering sound like something dragging itself across the floor. Rainer raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Kendra," he whispered, "lights off. Go dark." They extinguished their helmet lights and crouched low, moving slowly toward the sound. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, its walls covered in throbbing tendrils that stretched toward a pulsating mass at the center. Rainer's stomach churned as he recognized the shapes embedded within the mass, half-dissolved human bodies. Faces, frozen in agony, protruded from the writhing flesh. "Oh, God," Kendra breathed, her voice barely audible. The slithering sound grew louder. Rainer motioned for Kendra to stay back as he crept closer to the edge of the chamber. Peering around the corner, he saw it, a creature that had once been human. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of muscle, bone, and blackened veins, its movements jerky yet unnervingly fast. It dragged itself across the chamber, tendrils extending from its torso and probing the walls like searching fingers. The creature stopped, its head snapping upward as if sensing their presence. Its eyeless face turned toward them, and a guttural clicking sound emanated from its throat. "Move," Rainer hissed, pulling Kendra back as the creature lunged. Its tendrils struck the ground where they'd been crouching moments before, the impact cracking the floor. They sprinted down the corridor, the creature's shrieks echoing behind them. The comms crackled to life. "Status," Vega's voice cut through the static. "We've got company," Rainer barked, firing over his shoulder as the creature gave chase. The corridor was too narrow to maneuver effectively, its walls closing in like a living trap. "Get to the reactor," Vega ordered. "We're trying," Kendra shouted, her voice strained. She stumbled, nearly falling as a tendril lashed out, narrowly missing her leg. Rainer grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. They rounded a corner and came face to face with another abomination. This one was larger, its flesh bristling with spines and jagged bone protrusions. It roared, the sound a grotesque blend of human and alien agony. "Down!" Rainer shouted, shoving Kendra to the ground as he unloaded his rifle into the creature's chest. The bullets tore through its flesh, but it didn't slow. It swung a massive arm, smashing into the wall and sending shards of metal and flesh flying. Kendra scrambled to her feet, pulling a grenade from her belt. "Cover me!" Rainer fired in bursts, keeping the creature's attention as Kendra primed the explosive. She lobbed it toward the beast, the grenade embedding itself in the creature's torso before detonating. The explosion lit up the corridor, showering them with fragments of burning flesh and bone. The creature collapsed, twitching as its tendrils writhed in death spasms. Rainer pulled Kendra forward. "We've got to keep moving." When they finally reached the reactor chamber, Vega was already there, his armor dented and smeared with black fluid. He was setting charges along the reactor's main control panel, his expression grim. "Good timing," he said without looking up. "We're almost out of time." Rainer scanned the room. The reactor was infected too, its metal casing warped and covered in pulsating growths. Tendrils snaked along the floor, converging toward a central mass that throbbed like a heartbeat. "It's worse than I thought," Vega said, finishing the last charge. "We need to blow it now." "And what about us?" Kendra asked, her voice trembling. "There's an escape pod 2 decks down," Vega replied. "We trigger the charges, then we run." Before anyone could respond, the central mass shuddered. A deep, resonant growl filled the chamber as the tendrils retracted, pulling the mass upward. It unfolded like a grotesque flower, revealing a towering creature, its body a horrifying fusion of metal and flesh. The faces of the infected Marines were embedded in its torso, their mouths moving silently. The creature roared, its voice echoing with a chorus of agonized screams. "Go!" Vega shouted, opening fire. Rainer and Kendra joined him, their bullets ripping into the creature's body, but it barely flinched. It advanced, its massive arms smashing through the reactor's support beams. "Kendra, set the detonator!" Vega ordered. "I need time," she shouted, frantically working at the controls. Rainer emptied his magazine, reloading as the creature lunged at Vega. The lieutenant dodged, but the creature's tendrils wrapped around his leg, pulling him toward its gaping maw. "No!" Rainer yelled, firing point blank into the tendrils. Vega looked back, his eyes meeting Rainer's. "Get out of here!" Vega shouted, wrenching a grenade from his belt. He pulled the pin, holding it tightly as the creature dragged him into its mass. The explosion rocked the chamber, sending Rainer and Kendra sprawling. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Kendra finished setting the detonator. "It's armed. Let's go." Rainer grabbed her arm, and they sprinted toward the exit as the reactor began to overload. Behind them, the creature roared again, its screams blending with the escalating hum of the reactor. They didn't look back. There was no time. The corridor to the escape pods was a labyrinth of chaos. The Erebus groaned, its structure buckling as the infection tightened its grip. The air was hot and acrid, filled with the stench of burning flesh and melting metal. Overhead, lights flickered erratically, casting the hallway in a nightmarish strobe of red and black. The ship was dying, and so were they. Rainer and Kendra stumbled forward, their boots splashing through pools of organic sludge. Tendrils snaked along the walls, writhing like they were alive. Each step felt harder than the last, the oppressive heat and suffocating atmosphere draining their strength. "Just a little further," Rainer urged, his voice hoarse. Kendra nodded weakly, clutching her side. She'd taken a glancing blow during their escape, her armor cracked and her movements sluggish. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The infected weren't done with them yet. The creature's guttural shrieks echoed through the corridor, mingling with the distant rumble of the reactor's impending meltdown. The escape pod bay was within sight when the floor beneath them shuddered violently, throwing them off balance. Rainer hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding out of reach. He scrambled to his feet, pulling Kendra up as the corridor behind them caved in, a mass of flesh and metal consuming the space. "Go!" Kendra shouted, pushing Rainer toward the pods. "We don't have time!" Rainer grabbed her arm. "Not without you." They burst into the pod bay, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the ship, still clean, still untouched by the infection. But that wouldn't last. The bulkhead vibrated under the relentless assault of the infected, the creatures clawing and hammering at the barrier. "There!" Rainer pointed to the lone remaining escape pod. He rushed to the control panel, initiating the launch sequence. The pod's hatch hissed open, revealing a cramped interior barely large enough for one person. "You first," he said, motioning for Kendra to climb in. "No," Kendra said, shaking her head. "You're the one who can finish this. You've got the strength to make it mean something." "I'm not leaving you here," Rainer snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. "We both get out, or neither of us does." The bulkhead behind them began to crack, dark tendrils forcing their way through. The infected were almost upon them. Kendra grabbed Rainer by the shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "The signal is still broadcasting. Even if we destroy the ship, it's already out there. Someone has to warn them, warn everyone." Realization dawned on Rainer, and his stomach twisted. "Kendra." "I'll hold them off," she said, stepping back toward the bulkhead. "You get out of here. You tell them what happened. Promise me." The door gave way, the infected pouring into the bay like a tidal wave of flesh and bone. Kendra turned, drawing her sidearm. She fired into the horde, each shot buying Rainer a few more seconds. Her voice rang out over the chaos, fierce and determined. "Go!" Rainer climbed into the pod, his heart pounding. He didn't want to leave, but he knew she was right. If he stayed, her sacrifice would mean nothing. With shaking hands, he slammed the hatch shut. and activated the launch. The pod shuddered, the engines igniting as it blasted away from the Erebus. Through the viewport, he saw Kendra standing her ground, her figure swallowed by the swarm just as the reactor exploded. The Erebus erupted in a blinding supernova, the light consuming everything in its wake. The infected ship, the creatures, and Kendra, all gone in an instant. Rainer shielded his eyes, tears streaming down his face as the shockwave rocked the escape pod. As the pod drifted through the void, silence returned. The vastness of space stretched out before him, cold and indifferent. Rainer slumped back in his seat, his body heavy with exhaustion and grief. He stared at the flickering control panel, the blinking light of the distress beacon waiting to be activated. He hesitated. Once he sent the signal, others would come. They would find him, but they might also find it. The infection wasn't confined to the Erebus. Kendra had been right. The signal was still out there, a beacon calling out to anyone who would listen. He accessed the pod's recorder, his fingers trembling. He had to make them understand, had to ensure they didn't make the same mistake. "This is Corporal Rainer of the Erebus," he began, his voice raw. "If you're hearing this, stay away from LV-742. The signal, it's not a distress call. It's a trap." He paused, his mind flooded with memories of his squad. Their laughter, their bravery, and the horrors that had consumed them. His voice broke as he added, "We thought we could stop it. We couldn't. But maybe you can." He set the recorder aside and activated the beacon. The light blinked steadily, a tiny speck of hope in the endless darkness. As Rainer sat in the pod, watching the distant stars, he whispered a final promise. To Kendra, to Vega, to everyone they'd lost. "I'll make sure they know. I'll make sure it ends." And then he waited, alone in the infinite silence of space.